Terry was saying earlier, as far as this sort of line of evidence, I just gave you a little acronym. The question then goes, well, how do atheists respond to this evidence? Right? They're like, I have an answer, but no, I don't. Right? How do you respond to this? So we'll go again here to our buddy Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book called The God Delusion. And in this book, he says, this is the central argument of my book. He admits the appearance of design is overwhelming. He doesn't deny that. He goes, yeah, I mean, it totally looks like this world was designed. But as we said earlier, because we know there can be no such thing as God, we can't let that foot in the door. We have to go some other route. He goes, there's no explanation for it in physics. So where is his explanation? Well, maybe the multiverse theory, which relies on, what's that word? Luck. Now that's scientific, isn't it? Yeah. We don't know how the universe had a beginning, but, you know, maybe luck has a play in it. Yeah. That's really good. And then his fourth one, this one's the big one. Who made God? Well, if you're talking all about this, you know, the universe had to have a beginning, then who made God? Well, here's the problem with this question. It misunderstands the cosmological argument. The cosmological first premise says everything that has a beginning has a cause. But by the very definition of God, God is eternal. There is no beginning, no end. And this is what I was saying earlier. Aristotle and those guys, they would call it the unmoved mover, or the first cause. Right? When you trace it back, like, you know, what made me do this? Well, that did. What made that happen? Well, that did. What caused that? That did. Well, when you trace it all the way back, there has to be some sort of first cause, because you can't have an infinite past. How do we know you can't have an infinite past? Read Hilbert's Hotel illustration. You should be able to work it out. So, our buddies down at National Geographic hired a graphic artist. And he wrote, you know, they were writing this article about the multiverse. And this is a picture that he drew. Can you guys see it? A little hard to see. And in the article, one guy says this: it's sort of like we're brushing our ignorance under the rug of the very early universe. Yeah, I would agree. Because I'm not going to let some sort of demented French horn graphic artist picture convince me that the universe can create itself. Again, think about this. The universe created itself. Anybody home? If you're going to create, you can't create yourself, right? Because you have to already exist. But you can't already exist if you're going to create yourself. That's just a walking contradiction there. So I don't care what sort of pictures you can draw here. It's just philosophically absurd. All right. So again, this one's my favorite quote by this guy. The bottom line, Dr. Robert Jastrow, is this: for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peaks. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been there for centuries. All that evidence, all that travel, he gets there, and there's the preachers who said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Amen? All right, the teleological argument. This comes from the old argument by this guy named William Paley. Teleos means design. William Paley here. The argument goes like this: every design has a designer. Seems pretty simple. The question is this one: the universe and life have highly complex design. That's the thing that we're going to be talking about. But if those two are true, it follows that the universe and life had a designer. So the old argument is about walking in the woods. And some of us in here would love to see this guy's daddy walking by, or mommy walking by, right? But let's just say we see the little one. So we're going to let that one slide, right? Not enough meat. And there it is, sitting on the ground. Something spooks it, and it runs off, and then we look over there and we go, what is that little thing? Somebody tell me what that is.
Apple Watch.
It's an Apple Watch, right? And we go, oh, I see. That deer sat there long enough on those petals of flowers. And after many, many of hours of heat and random fluctuation and all that sort of other stuff, some sort of gearbox fell out of the sky, and just by chance, an Apple Watch came in a poop, and he pooped a watch. Yeah, exactly. Now, does that make any sense?
It does.
No.
Apple products too.
Yeah. Oh, here we got that guy. We got that guy. Okay. So the point is, though, that we still see that something that has design into it has to have an intelligence behind it. That's the argument. So science is a search for causes. There's two types of causes, non-intelligent and intelligent causes. You come over to something pretty spectacular like the Grand Canyon, and you would say, well, is this non-intelligent or intelligent? Well, we can take, our methods of science, and we can dump water at enough pressure and hit the ground, and guess what happens? We form canyons. And so we say, hey, there was probably some sort of massive water flow through here with enough pressure. Might have been the flood. I think it probably was. Right? But even if you think it was something else, still, natural causes made this happen. But then you get this. And you say, oh, I know. There was a group of vultures that were in this valley. And, they just spent millions of years pecking away at these rocks. And it just happened by chance that this is what they created. And they just have such a likeness to our presidents. Right? Wrong. I mean, come on, get real. We all understand when we see something like this that it has a pattern of design, and every design has a what? A designer, right? So we see intelligence behind this. Something as simple as a rock formation, then when you get to something even more complex than that, then we would say, yeah, there's only two types of causes, intelligent and natural. So what caused the universe? That's the question. What caused the universe? We only have two causes, intelligent design or non-intelligence by natural law. But we've already talked about how nature itself had a beginning. So nature couldn't have created itself. And let us not forget that science is built on philosophy. We already talked about this. This is what's important. If a scientist, and let me just say this. I think it's on your handout too. It's one of your blanks. Science doesn't say anything. Did you know that? Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. You read an article and it goes, science now says, science has discovered, science tells us. Baloney. Science doesn't speak. Scientists speak. And scientists are people. And people have biases. And sometimes people have prejudices. Because put yourself in their shoes. I have spent the past 30 years of my life. I went to college. I spent, 12 years in college, and I racked up a lot of debt. And I spent a lot of years studying, and I wrote term papers, and I wrote a thesis. And my entire career is based off of that research, and now I'm discovering something that tells me I was false. And if I come out with that, then I might be fired from my job. I might be refused tenure. I might lose my funding, because we all know how much money has a play on what we do. Anybody ever seen the movie Expelled with Ben Stein? If you haven't seen that, go watch it. Essentially, he interviews a bunch of people and shows how these guys who are starting to say, hey, it seems as if the evidence is pushing towards intelligent design, not the God of the Bible, just intelligence is behind our design. We don't know what the intelligence is, we just know that there's intelligence behind it. Fired. Refused tenure. Pushed under the rug. And it's like all this stuff's happening behind the scenes. Scientists have biases. So be very, very careful when you read something that unequivocally says, well, science now tells us. Look through it. Read between the lines and say, well, what scientist is saying this? What is his background? What's his philosophy? What's his worldview? And then you ask yourself this question. What evidence brought him to that conclusion? Because you might actually look at the evidence and go, oh, it's not as clear-cut as he might make it to be. Or read the dissenting views and see what other people are saying about it. Essentially, be a filter, not a sponge. Be a filter, not a sponge. Okay, the anthropic principle reveals the fingerprint of the Creator. And anthropos is a Greek word for man. This principle, part of the teleological argument, simply says this. Our universe is so finely tuned as to allow life that there's no other reasonable explanation than to say there has to be a designer behind it. Okay? So I'm going to give you a couple principles, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens of principles. And I'm just going to give you a couple quick ones. Number one, oxygen levels. Be thankful for our oxygen levels. Comprised of 21% of the atmosphere. If it was 25%, fires would erupt. If it was 15%, we would suffocate. So we're glad that that one is set in where it needs to be. I want you to imagine this. Imagine you walk into the universal control room and you see a bunch of dials on the wall. Our first dial is finely tuned to 21% of oxygen. So we need it to be there, because if we move it too much, we either have fires or suffocation. Number two, The universe, remember how we talked about it expanding? If it expanded too slowly, the earth would not exist. The universe would have collapsed back on itself. In fact, this is our buddy Stephen Hawking. He's a pretty smart guy. He says this: if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part in 1,000 million million a second after the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed back on itself and never developed galaxies. That's pretty finely tuned. That's a lot of zeros. If you don't know what 1,000 million millions of a second is, that's a lot of zeros. All right, the third one, the gravitational force. If it was altered by 1 part in 10 to the 40, the sun would not exist, and the moon would crash into the earth and shear off into space. You realize, I want you to think about this for a second. You essentially are sitting on a rock that is winging around space extremely fast, and we're spinning around a big campfire. And at any moment, we could just fling off in the middle of nowhere, and we would all just be wiped away. Why does that not happen? Because the Bible says in Colossians that He holds all things together by His power. And we're thankful for that. Because the only reason why you and I do not spontaneously combust right now is because God holds us by His power. Now, we know that. But I'm showing you here some different dials. So we walk into our control room, and one of the dials is oxygen, one of the dials is gravity, okay? And then here's the kicker. Not only do these dials, I'm only going to give you like 4 or 5, but there's like dozens and dozens. Not only do these dials have to be finely tuned to their own amount, but they're interwoven. So if you change one, all the rest of them are changed. All the rest of them are thrown off. They all have to have a ratio to each other, which makes it astronomically impossible that this would just happen by chance. Here's the fourth one. The average distance between stars in our galaxy is 30 trillion miles. You know what 30 trillion miles is? It's like 2 tanks in a Prius. 2 tanks in a Prius. Okay, so the space shuttle goes in orbit at 18,000 miles per hour. You know how many miles that is per second? 5 miles per second. So it would take you 201,450 years to travel 30 trillion miles. Or double that time if you have a woman, because you have to stop and pee a bunch of times for you. That's only to travel between one star to the next. That's not to travel to all the different stars that we know about. And essentially, science tells us. Anybody catch that? Scientists. What is that?
Science don't talk.
Science don't talk. That's right. You guys are listening. That there are more stars in the sand of the sea. I mean, I'm going to show you a video here in a second. And our universe is so radically huge. It'll blow your mind. In fact, here's our video. I got a little sound in here. The sound's just background music. Don't worry about it. Just watch the video. It's pretty amazing. And isn't it amazing how we think we're going to explore the universe? Right? And what is man that you are mindful of him? I mean, just to think about the universe, that massive. I can't even begin to comprehend it. And to think then, right, that God so placed us in this Goldilocks zone, that we're far enough away from the sun that we, don't burn up, but we're close enough to it that we're not freezing, and that, the gravitational and atmosphere and all these dials are perfectly fine-tuned so as to allow life. Look, you go anywhere on this planet, you will find life. You go to Antarctica, you found life. You go to the Sahara Desert and dig up sand. You go into the laboratory and put it under a microscope. You find life. You find life everywhere on this planet. And here's what's funny. You find it everywhere on this planet and they go, well, there couldn't be intelligence behind that. But then you go and you try to find, a water molecule on Mars and you go, oh, maybe there's aliens. Okay, I'm not understanding the double standards that are going on here. But here's another cool one. I really like Jupiter. You see this blob right here? This little blob in Jupiter? So that blob is bigger than our planet. That blob was created by a meteor. Now, I really want to root for Jupiter. And you should root for Jupiter too. Here's why. Jupiter is God's space vacuum. Because there are rocks rolling around in our solar system right now, bigger than our planet. And they are headed towards us. But the beautiful thing is Jupiter is so big and has such a gravitational pull that it whips all these rocks in and just takes those hits for us. Aren't you happy? So we say, go Jupiter! We need a Jupiter day. No, I'm just kidding. That's partially idol worship. Just kidding. You guys remember these people? February 1st, 2003, President Bush, Saturday morning, 9 a.m. Every news network is carrying his address. He talks about how this Columbia burned up in the skies over Texas as they were attempting to re-enter into our atmosphere. He went on to quote Isaiah chapter 40, verse 25 and 26. God compares himself to the expanse of the heavens, and he says that he names the stars one by one. And he said that the same God who created and named the stars knows the names of the 7 people who died today. And while they did not come home to us, we can pray that they are now all safely home. God compares himself to the universe because it is the only thing known to man by which we can stretch our imagination so far that we just give up. I mean, I saw that video, and every time I watch it, I'm just amazed. I give up. I give up trying to figure out how big. Then that's only the part that we know about the universe, not the parts that we don't know. And still, the universe is what? Expanding. And we don't even know what it's expanding into. You see, we're so ignorant in some of the things that we think we're smart on. But God compares himself to the heavens because he says, you want to know what I'm like, remove all limits from your mind, and then you may be able to grasp me. But that's impossible. We're not able to do that. We're finite beings. By our very nature, the only thing we've ever experienced is beginnings and ends. We don't know what it's like to be God. We don't know what it's like to be infinite. It's not illogical, it just goes beyond our information. It just goes beyond our experience. But that's why God compares himself here to the heavens. And it's beautiful when the Bible says, "For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his loving kindness towards those who fear him." Maybe now we'll have a better appreciation for that verse when we think about how high the heavens really are. And what is the second commandment? Not the second greatest commandment, but the actual second commandment. Have no graven images. Why? Because any time you try to make an image about God, you're trying to limit the infinite. You cannot limit, and God doesn't want to be limited. God doesn't want to be put in a box. God doesn't want us to try to say, here we can define you now. You can't define an infinite. You can only describe an infinite. And God gives us a lot of descriptions. All right, so conclusions thus far. Since the finite universe, time, space, and matter came into existence, then there must be something infinite outside of space, time, and matter that brought it into existence. That being must be powerful, eternal, and immaterial. That's from the cosmological argument. In light of the easy for me to say, anthropic principle, that being also must be intelligent. Because look, here's the thing. I don't understand physics because I didn't pay attention in high school because I was a knucklehead. But even for those who are the best in this world at understanding physics, they didn't create physics. I mean, think about that for a second. God not only understands all these laws, he created them. He doesn't just understand mathematical laws, he created them, right? Or they are part of his being, if you want to go down that right. That's fine. He still is the one who created this universe to work in this sort of way, understanding the thousands of variables that must coincide and interlock with each other so everything is balanced on a razor's edge. He did it. And then he sustains it by his power. So he's very, very intelligent, smarter than you and me. Let us not forget that. And then the next one, those are exactly the attributes the Bible applies to God. Wouldn't you agree? Have we said anything in this whole seminar using the cosmological and teleological argument and about the laws of logic and truth? Have we said anything that disagrees with what the Word of God says? That God is a God of order, that God is a God of laws, and he is a logical God, and that he created the world, and the world had a beginning, and our world is fine-tuned, and shows us that God is intelligent. That's exactly what the Bible says. But we did all this, let's see, we did all this without even going to the Bible. All right, the next point is life. So we talked about what caused the universe. Now we're going to talk about what caused life, that is life on this planet. You guys know what this is? An amoeba, right? This is an amoeba. This is where supposedly all life began. What some scientists want you to believe is this is the goo from which you came from, right? The goo to you via the zoo. You guys know that one? The infantile to the reptile to the crocodile to the Gentile. This is where it all began, this amoeba right here. Now, in Darwin's day, this amoeba didn't seem that complicated. Why? Because we couldn't see inside of it. We didn't have the technology to look at it. We saw this and we're like, oh, look at that little blob. That's cool. And so Darwin, reported his idea. It didn't seem like that big of a deal because it seemed as if there was simple life. That life was very, very simple at its basics levels, and then it evolved to the complex. We're going to talk about that. But they say it's through evolution. So let me make a distinction real quick here. If you've never heard this, there's a difference between macroevolution and microevolution. Macroevolution is where you go from the goo, right? You go up to the reptiles, birds, and all that. You change the different kinds. Microevolution is where you attempt to take fruit flies, right, and add mutations in. But guess what you always get? Fruit flies. You either get dead fruit flies, alive fruit flies, or you get some sort of mutated fruit fly. But guess what you always have? A fruit fly. And here's what's cool. The fruit fly, as you try to change it, always tries to force its way back to the happy medium of being a fruit fly. So it shows us that not only is the design intelligent, but the design has a purpose. There's a reason why an acorn always becomes what sort of tree? an oak tree, right? An acorn doesn't become a pepperoni pizza. You know, yeah, sure, right? I mean, some of us might wish that, but there's a reason why young people, if you give them nourishment, are going to grow up to be adults. It's like we are goal-oriented. It's like the world and all of creation is directed towards a purpose. And so anyway, so Darwin doesn't understand how complicated this thing is. I also want to point out about natural selection. So they would say, well, natural selection, you know, as things begin to adapt, they would select, you know, natural selection picks out that which is best fit for survival, da-da-da-da-da. Let's just stop for a second. I want to point something out here. It's always interesting to me how scientists will, on page 1 and 2, talk about how God is ridiculous and do away with God, and then on pages 4, 5, and the rest of the book, they simply assign to Mother Nature all the attributes of God. God doesn't exist. There can be no intelligence. Mother Nature chose in her infinite wisdom this thing to survive. Does that sound fishy to anybody? Natural selection is a contradiction of terms because the whole idea behind macroevolution is that there is no intelligent design behind it. But natural selection, when you select something, that means you have a choice, right? But how does natural selection have a choice? Again, we're just rolling around in contradictions here. All right, so this amoeba, we have an origin of life, only 2 possibilities, as we talked about before, intelligent or non-intelligent. Now, how many people like cereal? I love cereal. I like to mix cereals, you know, find like good combinations. I started to do this when I was getting low on 2 different cereals and start to mix them. Now I have like my specialty ones that I like to mix together. I can tell you what they are. I'm not giving up my trade secrets. But has anybody ever had Alpha Bite cereals? Not really a big fan, right? Kind of bland thing. I don't care about letters. I just care what it tastes like. So let's say you come downstairs one day and you want to get yourself some Alpha Bite cereals. And you see that the box is knocked over and you get this little message. Take out the garbage, Mom. And you look at that and you say, well, that stinking cat's been coming down here and messing around with the cereal box again. Is that what you think? You think the cat came and knocked over the box and then randomly spilled out these letters, take out the garbage, Mom? And when your mom gets home and she threatens to beat you, what do you say? That's not my fault. I didn't understand that that was a message from you. You think she's going to buy that? Or let's say you're walking along the beach one day and you see there, John loves Sandy. And you say, oh, crabs must have come out of the ocean, playing around on the beach. Or waves wash seashells and they just scratched this into the sand by chance. Is that what we think? No, absolutely not. We understand that there was obviously 2 people there. One named John, one named Sandy. So intelligent design from an intelligent being, Mom. So we have this thing, I don't know if you've ever heard of it or not, but it's called DNA. Right? Yeah, we've all heard of that. Come on now. In 1953, guys named Watson and Crick discovered DNA. Okay, and you can read all about that in this book called Signature in the Cell. It's a pretty hefty book. If you're not into science, I would not suggest it. If you kind of like history, you might like the first half of it because the guy essentially deals with the history behind how scientists came to understand what this was all about and the implications of it. But he does a lot of science stuff. Most of the things I didn't understand. But I read the book, tried to understand it, and if you're into science, you probably really love it. But anyway, so they found this DNA, which gives us a code, right? So we got the ATCG always attached here, A to T, C to G, but they're always in a different order, right? And depending on that order will depend on the information that comes out of it. Just real quick, the idea behind the book, the one I just told you about, Signature in the Cell, simply says that we don't find anything in our world where you have information without an intelligent mind behind it. Computer software program. I'm running PowerPoint right now, right? What happens if I go into the code of PowerPoint and start punching in numbers and letters? It ain't gonna work anymore, right? Or if I look at that and I see that there's a code in the PowerPoint, what am I gonna think? There's got to be a software engineer behind this program. And everything has DNA. Your genome is 3.5 billion letters long. That's pretty long, isn't it? And if you get one letter off, you might have like a nose like this long. Right? So thank goodness it's in the order that it's in. Another thing about DNA that they talk about is essentially the fact that DNA needs proteins, and then proteins need DNA. So what we have here is a whole chicken or egg thing. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Scientists cannot answer what came first, the proteins or the DNA. And again, that's something where, if you want to study that out more, I highly suggest reading that Signature in the Cell. Or if what you want to do is really dive into the cell and see the fact that it is essentially a factory, right? Read Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. What's really cool about that is he shows in there that there's this thing called the flagellum motor. Somebody knows about that. And you guys ever heard of a rotary motor? Okay, this is kind of where this idea comes from. That there's like this little thing inside the cell, and again, I don't know much about it, but it's like a rotary motor. And it does this little work, and it can shoot itself across the cell and get all of its work done. It's like a little transportation device. Where in the world did that thing come from? Because it's irreducibly complex. It's like your car. If I go outside and take your spark plugs out of your car, guess what your car's not going to do? That's not going to start, right? I don't care if you have a battery, and a carburetor, and a fuel injection, and a gas tank, and a steering wheel, and an ignition switch. I don't care if you have all that. If you don't have a spark plug, you're probably going anywhere. So the idea is, with the cell, all these things have to be there together for it to work. So again, you could study that more. But I just wanted to point out here that there's this great code, this software that we find inside of it. So if we see that take out the garbage mom, this little simple message, right? 4 words long, maybe 5, I guess if you count long, 5 words long. Nobody would conclude that that's random chance or fluctuations in the vibration of your heating and air conditioning unit that knocked it over on your table and outspilled these letters. We all understand that intelligence came behind this. So what comes behind 3.5 billion letter sequence, right? Let's just talk about this. If you look into the amoeba, there is information of 1,000 sets of an encyclopedia. That's a lot of information, don't you think? You get inside one amoeba and you can fit like 1,000 amoeba in an inch. And you get 1,000 sets of an encyclopedia. How do I know this? Because Richard Dawkins tells us. Here's our old buddy who doesn't believe in God in The Blind Watchmaker, page 116. He's the one who tells us that there's this much information. And in that movie, Expelled, that I was telling you about, Ben Stein interviews him at the end and essentially is asking him, like, well, how do you think all this got kicked off then? And when he keeps pressing him and keep pressing him, you know what Richard Dawkins says? Maybe aliens did it. And Ben Stein goes, oh, whoa, wait a second. Did I just hear you right? Do you believe in intelligent design? You see, aliens, who are the intelligence, is what Richard Dawkins said. Maybe the intelligent being aliens brought this to our planet and got life kicked off. Has Richard Dawkins, even if that happened, has he solved his problem?
No.
What did he do? He made it worse. All he did was push it one step back. Okay, now let's go to the aliens. How did they get started? Right? You still have the same problem there. Now, a lot of times people will attack you with what's called God of the gaps argument. That is, sometimes some well-meaning Christians might have done in the past. Well, we don't understand what this whole like thunder and lightning thing is about, so God does it. Right? Like when I was younger, I was like, well, God must be bowling. Right? That's what happens when thunder happens. God's bowling. He just got a strike. So we said, well, God did it. Well, scientists come around and go, well, now we know that this sort of charge happens and these reactions happen and that causes lightning. So you guys were just putting God into the gaps of your ignorance. Where you didn't know something happened, you said God did it. Now we can come around with science and show you how that happens by natural processes. You see where they would go with this? Now they think they can extrapolate that to everything. This is not God of the gaps argument. Why? Because it's not just us saying, well, we don't know how this works, so we're going to insert God into it. It's us saying, this is positive evidence for God. Because everything that we think about in this planet and in this universe, when we see a design, we say there's an intelligent behind it. When we walk outside and see our cars, and we see Ford on the side of it, or Dodge on the back of it, we say there must be a manufacturer. When we look at this computer sitting up here, we go, there was a designer behind that. Even your pen, your shoes, this microphone, this clicker. We all say there is designer behind it. Why? Because it has a design to it. So it's positive evidence for God. It's not fitting God into the gaps. All right, so the DNA of one human cell, 5 million pages of information. That's a lot. All of that's crammed into the nucleus of a cell, which is about 1/100th of the width of a human hair. So all that information is something that very, very small. And you have 1 trillion cells inside of you. Did you know that? So you think about all that information that you have. What about the human brain? information content, about 20 million books. Let's put that into perspective. You go to Madison Square Garden, that's like putting 1,000 books on each seat. That's what your brain can hold. Carl Sagan told us that, by the way. Carl Sagan, right? The atheist. All right. Stephen Meyer, the guy I told you about earlier, philosophy of science from Cambridge, signature in the cell. There isn't a single example anywhere in the history of the universe in which information came from anything other than an intelligent source. That's just universal experience. So when we see information in the cell, it is not wrong for us to say, what is the intelligent source behind that? Now, tell me this doesn't have implications for this, the abortion debate. Let me couch it to you like this. When your mom and your dad got together to make you guys have had this talk, right? Yeah. All right, making sure. We're not going to be crude here. Your dad sent 300 million soldiers to your mother's base camp, right? And you beat them all. So if you're ever feeling down on yourself, you just remember that you are way better than Usain Bolt or Michael Phelps. You outswam them all. The other 300 million, you won. And when you took your dad's little soldier, you got half your DNA code. And your mother's base camp, which was the size of about a period on the page of a book, is the other half of your DNA code. When those two connected, you have the DNA code, the same DNA code that you have today. You had all that you need to produce life and to grow to full adulthood. The only thing that separated you when those two connected from that moment to this moment today is space, time, air, and water. Now, there are people who will tell us that this is not a human because of its location, because of it's inside the womb, right? So it's not a human yet. So if location can determine whether somebody is a person or a molecule or a thing or an animal or whatever you want to call it, doesn't that have implications for, what about a 2-year-old? You see, because they'll go, well, it's not fully developed yet. Well, when are you fully developed? When you're 2? When you're 5? 12? 15? After puberty? 40? Like when? When are you fully developed? And you think, if you think I'm crazy, just understand there's already people, there's professors at Harvard, I can't remember the guy's name right now, who are pushing for essentially saying a person is not a person until after 2 years old. And they're just going to keep extrapolating that to the point where they're going to cut off those at the end of life and those at the beginning of life because we're moving into socialism anyways. And socialism will tell you that if you're not given to society, they want to get rid of you. Right? Because if you have more people taking from society than you have given to society, what happens? You collapse, right? So how do you solve that problem? You get rid of those who are taking from society. Who are those taking from society? Retired, babies, and people who are mentally handicapped. Right? So you start killing off those who are, well, they've had their life, right? Kill them off. Unwanted babies, kill them off. I think China's doing something, right? The whole one-child law. And then people who have mental handicaps and mental diseases, kill them off. You see, when you give up God, right, you start reasoning like this. This is why this has a lot of debates here. So you get to the point where you would say, well, a 2-year-old's not fully developed. See, the argument is, well, this thing is dependent upon the mother for life. So is a 2-year-old, right? So is a 5-year-old. So is a 10-year-old. I mean, how far are we going to go? You see, the logic doesn't extend. Here's a key for you. Any argument that is used to say it's okay to abort a baby that's in the womb, you simply ask if that's okay to do to a 2-year-old, and you'll see the fallacy of that argument. Well, what if a woman's raped? We'll go ahead and kill the baby. What if she's raped, has the baby, and then goes, just every time I look at the baby, I think about my rape. Can we kill it now? How come we could have killed it when it's in the womb, but we can't kill it now? What's the difference? Space, time, air, and water. Location. Why does that matter? You know? When are you fully developed? Just use those arguments for a 2-year-old. It's unwanted. This was an unplanned pregnancy. What happens if she has the baby and then says, this is an unplanned child, and the child's 5 years old? Can she kill it then? That's where we're going. But it's good to show those people that sort of stuff now. All right, so we get back to this. Take out the garbage mom. We see an intelligent design from an intelligent being. There's our buddy Fred Hoyle, who coined the term Big Bang by accident. And he says, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that his super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Supernatural. Isn't that interesting? Again, by a guy who's not a Christian. They're seeing what the evidence says, but they don't want to follow it all the way home. Why? Because they don't want to believe in God. We already showed about the presuppositions that people have, and I talked about the monkey in the room, which is morality, I think. All right, so the three great arguments for theistic God. We had the cosmological argument, the design, the teleological argument. Now we have the moral argument. Now, when I first started studying this one, I thought it was stupid. I'll just be honest with you. This one's dumb. This is not going to convince anybody. This is weak. The more and more I've studied these sort of things, the more I realize this was the best one. Because you don't have to know anything about science, with these two. You don't have to remember a bunch of facts. And everybody can relate to this one. Not everybody's into science. Not everybody's into fine-tuning. But everybody has this intuitive sense about something that's moral. I mean, look. I have a family of police officers. I actually used to be a police officer way back in the day. And we studied gangs. Gangs have a code of conduct. As skewed as they are, as wicked as the code of conduct is, they still have a code of conduct. And if you don't abide by it, they consider it wrong. I mean, they'll kill somebody, right? But if you do something against their code of conduct, now you've really messed up. It's interesting that everybody has some sort of code of conduct. Oh, let's go back here. So the argument is, if God doesn't exist, objective moral values do not exist. But objective moral values do exist. Pretty much everybody on this planet will say, you can bring them down to something, that they will say, I think that's wrong. Therefore, God exists. So let's break this down. You guys remember this? Right? We probably all remember exactly where we were that day. But if God doesn't exist, you can't say this is wrong. You could say it was inconvenient. You could say you don't like it. You could say it made you mad. You could say it made you sad. But it's simply your opinion versus bin Laden's. Because if there is no God, then you cannot disagree with the bin Laden's opinion. You could say it's not your opinion. You could say you would do things differently. You can even say you disagree with him. But you cannot say you, bin Laden, are wrong. It's simply your opinion versus his opinion. I love to do this with Mormons. If you guys ever get a Mormon come knock on your door, you don't have to worry about anything else. You sit them down, you go, look, Moroni chapter 10, verse 4. I've read it. And it simply says that if you take this book, if you pray over it, God will reveal to you that this book is true. Right? So I always bring them in. I'm like, yeah, I read the Book of Mormon, Moroni chapter 10, verse 4. And they're like, wow. They're kind of impressed that you can quote that verse. You go, yeah, I read it, prayed over it, you won't believe it. God spoke to me. Oh, he did? Yeah, absolutely. You want to know what he said? Yeah, what did he say? Told me this thing straight from the pits of hell. And they go, what? Well, he told me it's true. I said, well, what do we do now? And they look at you and they're like, I don't know. I said, well, we can throw rocks at each other. Or what we can do, I said, we can get away from our opinions and we can look at the facts. Now, doesn't mean you're going to convert them. But that's a way, you got to get Mormons to understand the difference between subjective and objective. Subjective is personal feelings, emotions, sort of things, your opinion. I like vanilla, you like chocolate. Objective is where you can't deny it. It's just a fact. 9/11 happened. Can't deny it, right? JFK was assassinated. George Bush was president. These things are facts. It doesn't matter what you feel about it. It just happened. All right, George, I know you don't believe in it. Holocaust. Doesn't matter. We still know a lot of people died. This is evil. This is something that we can all agree on, that what the Nazis did was wrong. Whether you believe in the 6 million Jews dying or not, I don't care. I do. But let's just say a bunch of people died. I mean, here's a picture right here of just a bunch of people dead from what the Nazis did. And in fact, this is me right here, standing in supposedly the conspiracy theory that George talks about. This is me standing in Dachau. This is one of those gas chambers where they tell you you're going to get water coming out of here so you can take a shower, but actually gas comes out and it kills you. So I was at that camp. It wasn't actually a concentration camp. per se. They kind of had different levels of camps, but this is a place where they would still take people and they would experiment on them. And when you walk into the gates, you see a sign up. It's actually like carved into the steel, or the iron, I guess, and it says, Arbeit macht frei. That means work makes free. That was a phrase that they would use. And you would walk in and you turn to the right and you would see this, and it was kind of interesting. And what they would do is they take you out to the courtyard and they would take you out there during winter and they'd pour ice water over you and see how long it took you to have hypothermia and die, and they would just do all sorts of experiments on you. So we can say, right, that at least most of us would agree that this is pretty evil. So if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. We've already talked about that. Evidence for an objective moral law. Number one, moral principles are undeniable. We know right from wrong best by our reactions, not our actions. So let's take the abortion debate, right? Somebody says, well, I think abortion's okay, and you say, well, I think it's wrong. One way to help them to see that they actually disagree that abortion's okay is say, well, would you be okay with it if we stuck you back in the womb? If you were the one who was in the womb and had a needle come in to shoot acid into your brain, would you be okay with it? What do you think somebody would say? No! No, I don't want you to shoot acid in my brain. Well, why is it okay for you to do it to somebody else? You see, we think it's okay. We might lie to somebody else. We don't like when somebody lies to us, right? People make all sorts of excuses for their actions, but we know, undeniably, something is right and wrong best by our reactions to what people do to us rather than our actions to other people. So there's this professor who assigned a class assignment. And he said, look, I want you guys, here's the format that I want you to write, your paper in. Just as long as you stick to this format, write the topic on whatever you want, and you're good to go. Just relate it to ethics, and as long as it's to the format, you're good. So an atheist student wrote a paper essentially saying that, there are no absolute objective moral values, everything's relative, this and this and this, and he turned it in. And then came time to grade the papers, and the professor wrote on his paper, F, I don't like blue folders. Gave it to him. And the atheist came back and said, man, what in the world? You said, it had to be this format. I made it this format. I cited my resources. I put it out, I did everything according to standard. And the professor said, I don't like blue folders. Yeah. And he said, well, that's not fair. And he goes, well, hold on a second. I get a lot of papers. Let me ask you a question. Yours was the paper that said there's no objective values. He goes, that's right. Yours was the paper that said simply values are like your personal preferences. Like I like vanilla, you like chocolate. And it's all just subjective. And he goes, yeah, that's right. And he goes, well, I don't like blue folders. You getting that? The atheist, it finally dawned on him, you see, by his reactions, that he didn't want to live in a world where moral values were subjective. He wanted that objective standard. I want the standard that you laid out. I don't want to live in a world where everything's subjective. You can just give me an F because you don't like blue folders. See, none of us want to live in that sort of world. Number two, we can't know injustice unless we know justice. This is very important because a lot of times people will say something like this. They'll go, well, you Christians, you guys do a lot of evil. Or God is such an evil God. One way that you can respond to this is saying, what's your standard of judgment? What's your standard to say that's evil? What's your standard to say God commanding the killing of the Canaanites is wrong? Please tell me, how do you base that? By your personal opinion? What do you do? Right? C.S. Lewis has a good quote. He says this, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how I had gotten this idea just and unjust, a man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You understand what he's saying? He goes, okay, I know something's crooked because I know what straight means. So how do I know what's unjust unless I know what is just? Sure, there's got to be some sort of standard by which we say that's just and that's unjust. The question is, what is the standard? Number three, real moral disagreements imply an objective standard. Here we have Hitler, here we have Mother Teresa. No, we don't agree with Mother Teresa theologically, but at least we can say that she did a lot of good, right? Or at least she had a good heart about wanting to do things, whatever. She just stands for a relatively good person. Let's just say that. And Hitler, we all know, stands for a pretty bad person. So how do we know who's right and who's wrong? Like intuitively, I think pretty much everybody in this room is going to go, she's better than him. Anybody disagree with that? All right. So intuitively, we're going to say that. But by what standard would we say that? And this is something you can ask atheists. By what standard would you say we want people like her rather than people like him? What's your standard? Well, there's got to be an objective standard. It's like the maps of Scotland. How do we know which map is better, map A or map B? Because there is a real place called Scotland, right? It's like you can make up any sort of map you want of Middle Earth because Middle Earth isn't real if you're creating it. But you can't make up a map of Scotland because there's a real place called Scotland. And so with Mother Teresa and Hitler, there is a standard by which we can judge them by, and it's called God's unchanging moral nature. He is the standard. It's his nature that is the standard of what is ultimately right and what is ultimately wrong. This is what our Constitution is based on. We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. Our founding fathers understood this principle. It was self-evident. All right, if there is no objective morality, we say the Nazis weren't wrong, love is no better than rape, freedom no better than slavery, religious crusades are not wrong, tolerance is no better than intolerance. You can't complain about the problem of evil. Because if you do away with God, you've done away with your ruler. You've done away with your standard. Look, there's three things that you can base your standard on. Number one is your own opinion, right? But if somebody looks at you and says, well, I think murder's wrong, and they're an atheist, you go, well, I think murder's right. Prove it to me. You can't. How are you going to prove it? It's just your opinion versus my opinion. Well, society says that murder's wrong. Well, go to 1940 Germany. Society said that murder was okay. What society are you talking about? American society or Chinese society? America in the 1920s or America today? Because America used to say homosexuality was wrong. Now it says it's great and something to be celebrated. What society are we talking about? Well, the majority. Hold on a second. The majority tells you what's right and wrong? What if the majority said that we should kill you and take all your stuff? Would you be okay with that? No! Right? So you can't base your objective standard of morality on any of those things. It's got to be on something outside of us. All right, so evidence for an objective moral law. We wouldn't have excuses for doing wrong if there was no moral law. You ever notice this? You ever notice people have this this innate thing of making excuses for when they do bad things? Well, I did that because, or let me tell you why I did that, or here's my excuse. Why don't you just say, hey, there's no such thing as right and wrong. There's no ultimate standard. I thought that was okay. Get over it. Because we intuitively know there's a standard. C.S. Lewis, I'm going to end right here with about this because we're out of time. It says, it seems that we are forced to believe in a real right and wrong. First, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. Wouldn't you agree with that? Even if that way is skewed, they still have this idea. Secondly, they do in fact behave in that way. They do not, in fact, behave in that way. The truth is, we believe in decency so much that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it. And consequently, we try to shift the responsibility. That's so good. We have this idea of right and wrong. We don't follow it, and so we get convicted, and we try to make excuses of why we don't follow it. All right, end with this, and we'll take our break. This is important, because it seems like people always mistake what we say when we go over this. We are not saying atheists can't be moral. Absolutely, atheists can be moral. I know some atheists who are way better than some Christians morally. Right? We do not say that atheists don't know morality. I'm not saying that atheists don't know murder's wrong, or rape's wrong, and torturing babies for fun is wrong. Sure, they know that things are. I've met some atheists that have some really good thoughts about what's right and what's wrong. They can know that. What we are saying is they can't justify their morality. They can't tell you why that's wrong. They can say this is wrong, that's wrong, but they can't tell you why it's wrong. They can theorize about how we know murder is wrong, but atheism provides no immaterial objective standard that establishes why murder is wrong. The standard of justice requires a theistic God. All right, I'm going to end with that right there.
I want to say something.
Yes, sir.
I couldn't tell by looking at those skeletons what their race was.
There you
I'm
go.
not denying that millions of people died. I'm
Yeah.
denying that 6 million Jews. I do deny that there's Holocaust.
Yeah.
I deny that 6 million Jews died.
I was just giving you a hard time, George.
Big difference.
I agree with you.
I don't want to leave here and say he don't believe in the Holocaust. I don't believe in the Holocaust. I don't believe 6 million Jews died.
All right. We just give George a hard time because we love him. Right? All right, Terry, you need to say anything?
No, take a break and we'll come back.
Okay, 10-minute break.